James Monroe was the fifth President of the United States, 1817 to 1825, and the last president from the Founding Fathers. He was the fifth President of the United States, 1817 to 25, who issued an important contribution to U.S. foreign policy in the Monroe Doctrine, a warning to European nations against intervening in the Western Hemisphere. The period of his administration has been called the Era of Good Feelings. On New Year's Day, 1825, at the last of his annual White House receptions, President James Monroe made a pleasing impression upon a Virginia lady who shook his hand. He is tall and well-formed. His dress plain and in the old style. His manner was quiet and dignified. From the frank, honest expression of his eye, I think he well deserves the encomium passed upon him by the great Jefferson, who said, Monroe was so honest that if you turned his soul inside out there would not be a spot on it. Born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in 1758, Monroe attended the College of William and Mary, fought with distinction in the Continental Army, and practiced law in Fredericksburg, Virginia. As a youthful politician, he joined the Anti-Federalists in the Virginia Convention which ratified the Constitution, and in 1790, an advocate of Jeffersonian policies, was elected United States Senator. As minister to France in 1794 to 1796, he displayed strong sympathies for the French cause. Later, with Robert R. Livingston, he helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. His ambition and energy, together with the backing of President Madison, made him the Republican choice for the presidency in 1816. With little Federalist opposition, he easily won re-election in 1820. Monroe made unusually strong cabinet choices, naming a Southerner, John C. Calhoun, as Secretary of War, and a Northerner, John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State. Only Henry Clay's refusal kept Monroe from adding an outstanding Westerner. Early in his administration, Monroe undertook a goodwill tour. At Boston, his visit was hailed as the beginning of an era of good feelings. Unfortunately, these good feelings did not endure, although Monroe, his popularity undiminished, followed nationalist policies. Across the facade of nationalism, ugly sectional cracks appeared. A painful economic depression undoubtedly increased the dismay of the people of the Missouri Territory in 1819 when their application for admission to the Union as a slave state failed. An amended bill for gradually eliminating slavery in Missouri precipitated 2 years of bitter debate in Congress. The Missouri Compromise Bill resolved the struggle, pairing Missouri as a slave state with Maine, a free state, and barring slavery north and west of Missouri forever. In foreign affairs, Monroe proclaimed the fundamental policy that bears his name, responding to the threat that the more conservative governments in Europe might try to aid Spain in winning back her former Latin American colonies. Monroe did not begin formally to recognize the young sister republics until 1822, after ascertaining that Congress would vote appropriations for diplomatic missions. He and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wished to avoid trouble with Spain until it had ceded the Floridas, as was done in 1821. Great Britain, with its powerful navy, also opposed reconquest of Latin America and suggested that the United States join in proclaiming hands-off. Ex-Presidents Jefferson and Madison counseled Monroe to accept the offer, but Secretary Adams advised, it would be more candid, to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France, than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. Monroe accepted Adams's advice. Not only must Latin America be left alone, he warned, but also Russia must not encroach southward on the Pacific coast. The American continents, he stated, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. Some 20 years after Monroe died in 1831, this became known as the Monroe Doctrine. In 1816 Monroe was elected President of the United States as the Republican candidate, defeating Rufus King, the Federalist candidate. Monroe received 183 electoral votes and King 34. By 1820, when he was re-elected, receiving all the electoral votes but one, the Federalists had ceased to function as a party. The chief events of his calm and prosperous administration, which has been called the Era of Good Feelings, were the First Seminole War, 1817–18, the acquisition of the Floridas from Spain, 1819–21, the Missouri Compromise, 1820, by which the first conflict over slavery under the Constitution was peacefully settled, recognition of the new Latin American states, former Spanish colonies in Central and South America, 1822, and most intimately connected with Monroe's name the Annunciation, in the presidential message of December 2, 1823, of the Monroe Doctrine, which has profoundly influenced the foreign policy of the United States. Not until 1848, when James K. Polk was president, did the first reference to Monroe's statement as a doctrine appear. The phrase Monroe Doctrine came into common use in the 1850s. The principles of President Monroe, as the message was referred to in Congress, consisted of three openly proclaimed dicta: no further European colonization in the New World, abstention of the United States from the political affairs of Europe, and non-intervention of Europe in the governments of the American Hemisphere. In the diplomatic correspondence preceding the proclamation of these principles in the President's message was a fourth dictum not publicly associated with the doctrine until 1869. The United States opposed the transfer of any existing European colonies from one European sovereign to another. It is generally concluded that Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was the sole author of the non-colonization principle of the doctrine. The principle of abstention from European wars and politics was common to all the fathers of American independence, inherited and expressed by the younger Adams all his professional life. In cabinet meetings, Adams also urged the dictum of non-intervention in the affairs of the nations of the Western Hemisphere. But Adams had no idea of proclaiming these dicta to the world. Monroe took responsibility for embodying them in a presidential message that he drafted himself. Modern historical judgment considers the Monroe Doctrine to be appropriately named. President Monroe and his wife remained smitten by France after their sojourn there, and with their daughters often spoke French together when they were in the White House. Elizabeth Monroe clothed herself in Paris creations and insisted on French etiquette and French cuisine at her table. Given the opportunity to refurnish the Executive Mansion when it was rebuilt after its destruction in 1814, the Monroes spent lavishly on gilded furniture, silverware, and various objets d'art imported from France. Some items that the president had purchased from impoverished French noble families while he was minister he now lent or sold to the government for use in the Executive Mansion at prices some considered suspiciously high, although Monroe was later cleared of impropriety. The First Lady, who was always in fragile health, suffered from an unidentified malady. She was often away from Washington for months at a time visiting her married daughters. To the considerable irritation of Washington society, she discontinued Dolly Madison's practice of paying courtesy calls on Washington hostesses. Still, Elizabeth Monroe was not without ardor. Shortly after her arrival in France, during the Reign of Terror, she helped to rescue Madame Lafayette, wife of the Marquis de Lafayette, from prison, and perhaps saved her from the guillotine. On the expiration of his second term, Monroe retired to his home, an estate called Oak Hill in Northern Virginia. In 1826 he became a regent of the University of Virginia, and in 1829 was a member of the convention called to amend the state constitution. Having neglected his private affairs and incurred large expenditures during his missions to Europe and his presidency, he was deeply in debt and felt compelled to ask Congress to reimburse him. In 1826 Congress finally authorized the payment to him of $30,000. Almost immediately, adding additional claims, he went back to Congress seeking more money. Congress paid him another $30,000 in 1831, but he still did not feel satisfied. After his death, Congress appropriated a small amount for the purchase of his papers from his heirs. Monroe died in 1831 like Jefferson and Adams before him on the 4th of July in New York City at the home of his daughter, Maria, with whom he was living after the death of his wife the year before. In 1858, the centennial year of his birth, his remains were reinterred with impressive ceremonies at Richmond, Virginia. After Liberia was created in 1821 as a haven for freed slaves, its capital city was named Monrovia in honor of the American president, who had supported the repatriation of blacks to Africa. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, and many other prominent statesmen of Monroe's time all spoke loudly in his praise, but he suffers by comparison with the greater men of his time. Possessing none of their brilliance, he had, nevertheless, to use the words of John Quincy Adams, a mind, sound in its ultimate judgments, and firm in its final conclusions. Some of Monroe's popularity undoubtedly stemmed from the fact that he was the last of the Revolutionary War generation, and he reminded people of those heady times when the struggle for independence was in the balance. Tall and stately in appearance, he still wore the knee breeches, silk stockings, and cocked hat of those days, and many of his admirers said that he resembled George Washington. Considered the last founding father president, James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758 into an affluent, slave-owning family in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His parents, Spence and Elizabeth Monroe, had aspirations for their eldest son, sending him to nearby Campbelltown Academy. James' childhood changed dramatically when both of his parents passed away within 2 years of each other. Joseph Jones, who became a paternal surrogate for the Monroe children, encouraged James to continue his education by attending the College of William and Mary. Monroe enrolled but later left to enlist in the Continental Army's 3rd Virginia Infantry Regiment. After the war, Monroe married Elizabeth Courtwright in 1786, the couple had 3 children together. In terms of military, political, administrative, and diplomatic experience, James Monroe was one of the most qualified individuals to ascend to the presidency during the 19th century. He fought in the American Revolution and was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, served in the legislative bodies of the Virginia General Assembly and the United States Senate, as well as governor of Virginia, held diplomatic posts across Europe for different administrations, and served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, briefly acting in both capacities, during the James Madison administration. He also studied law with Thomas Jefferson. In fact, because of his relationship with Jefferson, Monroe purchased land adjacent to Monticello in Albemarle County, calling it Highland. This plantation was one of several properties that Monroe owned during his lifetime, along with over 200 enslaved people who provided the labor to sustain the family, their guests, and the comforts they enjoyed. Some of these individuals accompanied the Monroes to Washington as well, and later the White House. In 1803, President Jefferson entrusted Monroe and Robert Livingston to acquire territory from France and secure access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. The men exceeded all expectations, acquiring New Orleans and some 828,000 square miles west of the Mississippi for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase opened up new opportunities for white settlers, often at the expense of Native Americans, and it also created a volatile mix of expansionism and slavery. As the country expanded westward, the issue of permitting slavery in new territories would continue to threaten a fragile union. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, signed by President Monroe, temporarily defused the situation. After the War of 1812, the United States experienced the era of good feelings, relative political peace, economic growth, and nationalist fervor. President Monroe invigorated the spirit with goodwill tours throughout the country and ensuring that the public buildings at Washington, including the President's House, were restored after they were destroyed by the British. Working with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Monroe professed American sovereignty from European nations while asserting a national right of influence over the Western Hemisphere. This idea, later called the Monroe Doctrine, shaped the next century of international relations between the United States and the world, influencing American presidents and policy makers who sought to make the country a global power. Thank you for watching this video.